Hi everyone and welcome. What you see here are my mixed tray of worms. And I refer to it as my mixed tray because it has 3 different types of worms in it. You'll notice here it says RW red wigglers, ENCs, European night crawlers, and blues, Indian blue worms. So now it was 6 weeks ago, 42 days ago, that bin right there was launched. And it was launched with the worms that came out of this bin right here. And on that day that the last of those worms were taken out of there, this tray full of the castings that they left behind has just been sitting here. So in most cases, people are anxious to get the castings into their garden or use them to, nourish their plants. Well, I've got other castings, so I'm not desperate for them. And I'm not desperate for the use of the tray either. So I haven't really been inclined to really revisit this tray in all that time. So the castings have basically sat here. And I've thought about recently maybe treating this as possibly a cocoon nursery. Because I keep wondering if perhaps maybe some, cocoons were left behind by the worms that got relocated. And I wondered if maybe there'd be an opportunity here to try to, collect up some worms before these castings actually go to use out in the garden. So with that thinking in mind, I did come in here at one point and drop in a piece of banana, thinking that maybe if there were some baby worms that were beginning to hatch, then they might be hungry and they might be attracted to that banana. But I haven't checked on it. It's just been sitting there. So I figured if we take a look in there and we do see some baby worms, then we might actually initiate an attempt to try to round up any baby worms that have possibly hatched in this container. So I was thinking about doing that today, as long as I was coming down here to feed this other bin anyway. This bin hasn't been fed in 10 days, and I've got some food for them set aside. So I'm going to take a quick look at what's going on in these 2 bins. So let me put on a glove and we'll get to work. Just a little bit of honest disclosure. I think I even made reference to this tray when I was shooting a video yesterday, and I believe I made mention of the fact that I have not even looked inside of this tray in all that time that it's been sitting here for 6 weeks. So, in all honesty, I can't even remember when I put that banana in here. So I guess I sort of said it and I forget it, but I forget it so bad that I don't even remember when I did it. So it looks like we had actually had a piece of paper resting here on the top of the castings, which has soaked through so much that it won't even come off the plastic anymore. So I guess there's some sufficient moisture in here to really dampen that piece of paper to the point where it's not really even manageable anymore. So it does look like we've got some stuff going on here, a little bit of green mold growing on this piece of banana here. So let's see if we could just set this banana aside briefly. I thought this was a piece of banana too. I think it is. And I definitely spotted a baby worm here. I can't tell just from looking at the worm what its age is. I believe one thing for sure though, it is a pretty small sized worm. And it is quite possible that when I went ahead and lured the worms out of this tray to relocate them into their new home, there is that possibility that I could have left some worms behind in the process, especially if they were really tiny and hard to see. And that sounds like it could have possibly been the case with this little guy. Because if this little guy had been born in here, I would think that they might be a little bit smaller than this. But it's hard to say. And the other thing I noticed over here was a worm cocoon. And it's fairly dark in color, but not very, very dark. So that probably means that there's maybe a little bit more potential for babies to get born in here. So So now here I'm observing another worm, but one that's apparently a little bit smaller. So it does seem like there might be a potential to round up worms from this tray. I guess we can kind of look around. The entire contents of the tray have remained nice and damp and comfortable for the worms with that plastic covering over the top of it. I didn't really want the material in here to dry out too excessively, although just from handling it, it does feel like it does have perhaps a little bit more moisture than is really necessary. So much so that some of this material seems to be clumping together a little bit. Perhaps not the most ideal situation, and perhaps from the perspective of airflow, not the most ideal situation either. So I think I just spotted another baby worm over here, another fairly small sized one. Just from looking around the banana, my initial impulse was that there's not a whole lot going on in here. But as we continue to just probe around through the material in general, we did start seeing worms. And, you know, I guess a possible explanation for that would be that the material probably still has a good amount of uncomposted, uneaten food and bedding material scattered within it, meaning that a worm wouldn't necessarily feel compelled to seek out that banana because it was hungry, because, you know, anywhere it goes it can probably locate bits of food to nibble on and not have to travel to go get it. If we do decide to follow through with the concept of treating this as a nursery bin, then I've got some fresh bedding that I pulled together. I took some newspapers and ran them through my shredder because I used the last of my shredded newspaper yesterday. So I've got a restocked supply that we could use along with some other materials that I have on hand to build a space within the bin that the worms could be potentially rounded up into. And as I keep looking, you could see I keep bumping into another worm. Almost every handful of material that I push aside, I notice a little bit of movement within it, and it's usually a little baby worm over here too. And I've just been sort of stacking them up over here arbitrarily, no real rhyme or reason. But you know, I don't know if it's necessary to go through the entire contents of the bin. I think I'm satisfied with the idea of giving this a try. Yesterday I bought an end to the last of my Cocoon nursery baby bins, where I was collecting night crawlers. I had a couple European night crawler bins and an African night crawler bin, where I had done the same thing intentionally, putting the castings aside to let all the cocoons that I had observed within the material have enough time so that the worms can begin to emerge from those cocoons, and that they'd be able to get rounded up at some point in the future. So I suppose we could, you know, follow through with a similar thinking here, even though it wasn't set, you know, this bin wasn't set aside deliberately with that in mind. It certainly seems like it's a good candidate for the same treatment. And it makes me wonder if it's something I should do in all my systems, because I guess the results of the bin that I pulled the baby worms out of yesterday seemed like after, I don't remember how many days, I believe it was about 75 days that tray had sat around, giving time for the cocoons to hatch and for the baby worms to congregate in a given space within the bin that was set aside for them, with fresh bedding and fresh food and everything. And it did seem like many hundreds of worms came together and were extracted from that and restored or returned back into one of my active worm populations. And since I've been kind of experiencing some issues lately Luckily, I'm not in the middle of any issues at the present time. It does feel like I've stabilized the issues that I was encountering. But the result of some of those issues was a fairly significant loss of worms in my wormery. So I guess I'm also, in a way, looking for opportunities to replenish my worm population numbers. And an easy enough way to pull that off would just be to hang on to the castings from my finished systems and give the material and the cocoons within that material some time for the babies to emerge, and then some extra time after that for the babies to get rounded up. Alright, so just thinking out loud, but I'm also at this point probably using up a lot more time than is necessary for this. I've pretty much made up my mind, I think, that even though I was kind of writing off the whole cocoon nursery concept as a completed experiment, and that I wasn't really planning on doing a whole bunch more of that in the near future, I believe in this case we probably will. Try to set this system up in such a way that the babies that are cruising through this stuff might have a place to gather. I guess another option would be to just leave this system to be as is and let the worms pick through all the remaining scraps of food that's in the material still, and whittle that down to the point where they're really looking for some sort of a food source, and then when I set up a migration area for them, they would be that much more inspired and motivated to congregate in the feeding area. So decisions. I did shred a bunch of paper, so I definitely have a whole bunch of material here right next to me, ready to go to serve that purpose. I've been putting an extra emphasis on having a lot of bedding on hand of different types to use for all my worm bins. Try to run all my bins with a lot more volume, a lot more space for the worms to explore and live in. Hoping that in itself triggers a response within the worms to try to occupy that available space with more baby worms, hopefully triggering some reproduction and mating within my worm populations. So I guess here and there I do find clumps that I feel compelled to break apart into small pieces, but I could spend all day doing that, so I should probably nip that behavior in the bud and stop doing it now. And I've been moving the worms back and forth from place to place as I move the material around. I never know if I'm just bumping into the same worms that I was handling earlier. But it does seem like I keep encountering worms everywhere. And maybe because I've actually agitated all the material in the bin at this point, perhaps I've taken them out of sort of a lazy hanging around state and kind of gotten them all moving now, so that it's much easier to spot them since they're moving. Alright, so let's do this. Let's set it up. Let's set it up the way I've been setting all my worm nurseries up that have sat around for this much time. After 40 some odd days, it's usually around this time that I rig the bin in such a way that I've given the worms a nice fresh environment with nice new bedding and a fresh food supply to hopefully be gravitated towards, and at the same time I cover up the material within the bin with only a piece of paper versus plastic, so that the material has an opportunity to start to dry off. And this material could probably benefit from drying off a little bit, because it is a little bit more damp than I would want it to be, I think. And another result of it drying would be the worms probably wanting to move out of it and seek out a more comfortable, more damp space to be in. So let's start making space over on this edge of the bin to set this whole thing up. Sometimes in the past, when I set up a baiting area like this, sometimes I set up sort of a barrier wall in between the finished casting area and the new space where all the fresh bedding is being put in, just to make it a little easier for me to see, you know, where the dividing line between those two regions is. And I guess, you know, what happens as a result of that is that sometimes these really nice fresh castings get mixed together with some uncomposted bedding bits and some scraps of stuff. So, you know, I certainly have the option to do that again, as I usually do. Or not usually, but sometimes do. So I'm just trying to decide if that's the way I want to play it, or do I just want to set up the feeding zone, nudge up the castings to it, and let it go. Maybe that's the route that we'll take. We'll just set up a space for them to hang out in over here and not go too crazy trying to set it up. So I've got some of that nicely shredded newspaper here that I had chopped up earlier this morning to replenish my supply. So perhaps we'll lay that in here as sort of the initial foundational layer of material to build this up with. Just trying to decide how big I want this to be. That looks like a pretty decent size. So what you see here is something that just called out to me when I went up into the kitchen to grab the food that I was going to use for today's feeding as well. So it's just a piece of soiled paper towel, and sitting right next to it was a really sharp piece of wood, kind of like a shish kebab skewer, and it was calling out to me. It was just, you know, telling me that this was going to be our partition wall to help kind of separate the baiting area from the finished castings slightly, making it really easy to see where the baiting area is, but also perforated with a whole bunch of little holes to make it very easy for the worms to pass through it and gain access to the fresh area that we're setting up for them over here on the side. So it looks good. I'm going to use it just like that. So now, besides this stuff over here, all this shredded paper, I also have my collection of leaves. So I thought that it would be kind of nice to create sort of a mixed bag of different types of bedding into which we're going to place some kitchen scraps. And the kitchen scraps that I normally feed with down here in my wormery are materials that have been placed into the freezer. And today, the stuff that the worms are getting is not been frozen. It's a whole bunch of salad still sitting in its bowl here that had been left in the refrigerator for just a little too long. And all the leaves were starting to turn brown and wilting, and it just didn't look very appealing anymore. So it seemed like it would be a good thing to use in today's worm bin maintenance activities. So I didn't even put it back in the fridge last night. What I did was I just left it out on the counter, and I'm sure that probably contributed to the leaves getting even more brown. So the feeding is going to consist of a whole bunch of nice small particle size salad for the little baby worms, in addition to all this coffee as well. So let's start sprinkling in some of this food, because I'd like to cover it all up thoroughly with even more bedding. And I don't know, I know that baby worms have a voracious appetite, but I don't think it's necessary to go too overboard setting up this feeding area. So I'm kind of got to get my mindset out of, you know, feeding a whole tray of adult worms and think more in terms of what's needed to feed a bunch of little baby worms. So I think that should do. I'm just trying to visualize what its general size is going to be, because what's going to go in here now is just some more bedding material. I have another type of bedding here, which is cardboard, little chunks of cardboard. But before we go any further, I also want to add grit, because the baby worms are probably going to need some grit to go hand in hand with their feeding. So the grit that I use is pulverized eggshell. So we're just going to drop some of that in here too. And this way the baby worms have the grit that they need to eat the food that I'm giving them. So, what do we got left? I think I'm going to go ahead and just cover up with leaves at this point. The plastic covering that was covering the entire bin at this point is going to be what we're going to use to cover the feeding area here. But the rest of the castings in the bin are going to be left exposed to the air. I'm just trying to decide if I want to leave them just exposed to the air to let them even dry more quickly, or do I want to cover them with some paper, which would hinder the drying process a little bit, but still allow for the evaporation of some moisture, let it escape over time. So I don't know. Let's just start backfilling some of this castings material here over into the feeding area. Try to back up the level to be pretty equivalent. Let's see, we could probably put this banana down in here too, but I'd like it submerged below the coverings. I mean, the plastic will also be covering things here a little bit. I just don't want to have stuff sitting out in the open that could attract pests. That's my main reason usually for wanting to make sure that the foods that I put into my worm bins are pretty, you know, deep down within the material rather than just resting out on the surface. And let's see here. What's the next step here? Do we cover up with paper or don't we? I don't know. Maybe for now we'll just leave it uncovered. I'm sure it's going to get pretty dry, and then we'll see no real worm action out on the top surface. Hopefully we'll start seeing some worm action down here where the food has been applied. I'm also trying to think in terms of moisture. Besides the moisture that's going to, you know, come out of the foods that are in there, if I put the plastic out here a little bit, some of the moisture that would normally evaporate out of this stuff here would be captured and help hydrate the dry stuff that's down in here. So maybe in the beginning I'll just spread the plastic covering out a little bit more thoroughly beyond the perimeter of the feeding area, so as to capture some of the moisture coming off this material and allow that to help hydrate the feeding area. So, all right, I guess now I'm back in the business of having a cocoon nursery, which is cool. Let's see here, this poor piece of plastic, it looks so terrible with all this paper stuck to it. So I guess we'll just fold all that nasty stuck paper to the inside, kind of get it out of view a little bit, and then we'll start covering up. And like I said before, we're just gonna let this plastic drape out over the castings a little bit, but very thoroughly cover the feeding area. And I guess the next time we come back in here, we'll probably find that the feeding area has become nice and damp. All the stuff that was placed in there dry will have moistened up a bunch, and hopefully it's going to start attracting baby worms. And hopefully as this stuff over here dries, it will also create a response of the baby worms leaving. Alright, I spent a lot more time in this bin than I thought I would. I still got to get the adult worms out here and get them fed too. So let's proceed with that. Okay, now I've got cardboard coverings in here. I can't recall if that cardboard covering was the way we left it last time, or if I set that up after. In some of my bins I've been leaving plastic coverings on as a temporary solution and putting myself, setting myself up with some sort of a reminder to make sure that I remove the plastic coverings, just to make sure that the bins are getting adequate airflow and ventilation. So this The system might have been upgraded with paper and cardboard coverings after the last time we checked in on it. I just don't really recall. And that's kind of the direction I'm going in most of my systems at this point. The place that we fed last time, as indicated by that coffee filter that I just took off, was right down here in the middle. And I think, like I mentioned earlier, it was 10 days ago that occurred. The other thing I did in here 10 days ago was that I kind of displaced all of the material that was in here, kind of moving it all aside and laying some fresh bedding down beneath the material, and then nudging it aside, laying some fresh bedding down, and then piling all the existing stuff that was in the bin on top of a fresh bed of nice new bedding. So we could see all down here at the very bottom is all that fresh bedding that this bin was upgraded with last time. And you could really see that the worms are enjoying it. I mean, even though the food was placed into the middle of the bin, you could see that the worms have really made themselves at home within all of this bedding material that's out in the far edges. Because, I mean, while it's, you know, it's bedding, but it also doubles as a food source for the worms, so they're perfectly content to nibble away on all the leaves and paper and cardboard and stuff that you set up as bedding for them too. I guess it's really just sort of a matter of what they're in the mood for. Alright, so kind of nice to see what's happening out there on the far edges. Usually it would be in the feeding area that you would expect to see kind of a worm party, but we're already seeing nice amounts of worms all over the place, even on the far reaches of the bin furthest away from where the feeding was applied. So I'm just curious. I'm sure we'll see something quite similar over here. Let's take a peek. Here too, we could see good numbers of worms zipping around as soon as we unearth the space that they're inhabiting. No particular concentration of worms in any one given space. It seems like they're all just scattered about. All of them seem quite content, and the material in here looks like it's got a nice moisture level too. I've been worried, you know, since I was kind of leaning towards enhancing the bedding in all my systems significantly. I've been doing just that, but I've been doing it in a way that I add most of the bedding in a dry state, and hoping that it'll just dampen over time by being exposed to either the existing damp material in the bin or just absorb some of the moisture that's coming off some of the foods that they're given. So I'm quite pleased to see how things are looking in here. All the material has a nice moisture level to it, and that's kind of what I was hoping for. And it tells me that I don't have to worry so much about moisture, even if I'm using a lot of dry bedding. In time it'll dampen and become usable by the worms as either food or a place to be. So the place that the food had been placed last time was right down here in the middle. But, you know, 10 days you might not expect to see too much. And I believe that the types of foods that were provided last time were foods that were pretty easy, fast composting type materials. I did review the video, but I'm kind of not remembering exactly what types of foods there were. I remember banana peels, I remember cucumber bits, I remember pieces of asparagus and broccoli. So I believe it was just a wide array of different types of vegetable bits, all small particle size, all stuff that should have probably very easily broken down quickly, and it would have been frozen stuff too. Stuff that, because it was frozen, would break down quite quickly as it thaws. So I'm just kind of, I've checked the very middle and checked the very edges, but it seems like the section right in between is where you're also going to see a good number of worms hanging out, right on the outskirts of where the feeding had been applied. So this bin is very interesting. There's just so many worms in it all over the place. Seems like it does make really good sense to make sure that they've got plenty of space within the bin to occupy, because they are making good use of all of it, whether it's right where the food was or even in the furthest, most distant areas in the bin, away from where the food was. So I guess the worms feed, and then they go roam around. Maybe they're not always just all about the food. Alright, so I've opened up a pretty good size opening here in the middle. A nice big gap that we could drop today's feeding into. This must be where there was a pile of yummy food. Definitely an interesting bin. Good, healthy, large population. Okay, let's proceed with getting today's feeding in here. I guess we're going to utilize a lot of this existing bedding that I have here of various types. A little bit more of this shredded paper that I prepared this morning. Perhaps a handful of this shredded cardboard as well. I think as a topping layer, we're probably going to place in leaves. So I've got a good amount of stuff here, and it's all stuff that I think is going to go pretty quickly, even though it wasn't frozen. And it might be a bit more than I usually apply, but I don't know, lately I have been applying fairly generous feedings along with the fairly generous application of bedding. And something that I usually don't give my worms too much of, which is onion, is in here too. Onion is perfectly suitable for worms. It's just the fact that it gets a little bit stinky sometimes in the process of decaying and breaking down. I think it's just that reason that some people shied away from using it in their worm bins. But I'm not worried about it. I'm sure the worms are going to enjoy it. Alright, very nice. I think before we put the leaves on top, I think what I'll do is grab one more handful of this shredded newspaper, since I have so much of it on hand. We're just going to stack it on top of the food that they just received. Very nice. Well, I emptied out the last of my leaves, and I even went so far as to stir it all together and cover everything up. And I just realized that none of that was captured on the video. So you can see I'm not even wearing a glove anymore. I was actually upstairs editing the video, and I noticed that the last place we were before the video cut out was just prior to me putting the leaves in here as covering over the food. So I just figured I'd shoot down here really quick, try to provide the video with a somewhat more graceful ending than just having it cut off there. So I brought the bin back out here on the bench and uncovered it to the point where I can sort of try to recover and finish the story and end the video without it looking like just a technical glitch. But I tell you, I don't know if you own a GoPro, but if you're thinking about buying the newest one, the Hero 9 Black, I recommend don't get the camera because it's just riddled with issues. And perhaps the biggest problem was that I downloaded an update this morning, and the camera's just been behaving crazy all morning as a result of that, I believe. So whatever, totally different topic. So that's it, end of the video. Again. So hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Take care. Have a nice day.